Theron had not planned to follow the maid home. He had not planned any of this. Yet here he stood, pressed against the cold stone of a narrow alley wall in the lower quarter of Ashenmere, watching the woman cross the last stretch of cobblestone toward a small cottage at the far end of the lane. She walked quickly, the way she always did, head down, shoulders drawn in, moving like someone who had spent years perfecting the art of not being seen. He knew that walk. He had been watching it for weeks now, without understanding why. Drawn to her movements the way the tide was drawn by the moon, helplessly, relentlessly, without reason or permission. The cottage was modest. Timber frame, thatched roof, patched in two places, a window box with herbs that had no business thriving in soil that poor, a home held together by stubbornness rather than craftsmanship. She reached the door and knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more, a signal. The latch lifted from inside. A boy stood in the doorway. Small, no more than 4 years old, barefoot on the stone step with a wooden figure clutched in one hand and sleep still heavy in his dark eyes. He looked up at the woman and his whole face changed, broke open into a grin, so wide and unguarded it made something twist beneath Theron's ribs. A grin that belonged entirely to this woman, that she had earned through 1,000 bedtimes and scraped knees and whispered reassurances in the dark. "Mama." The woman sank to her knees and pulled the child against her chest, pressing her face into his hair, like she was breathing him in, like he was the only air that mattered. The boy squirmed happily, chattering about his day, and the woman held on a beat longer than necessary. The grip of someone who had spent the entire day, afraid she might not make it back. Theron could not move. He had stopped breathing. Because the boy had lifted his head and turned slightly, and the face looking past the woman's shoulder was not a stranger's face. The jaw was too familiar. The shape of the brow, the set of the mouth, the way the dark hair fell across the forehead in exactly the wrong direction. He had seen that face in mirrors his entire life. He had seen it in portraits of his father and his grandfather and every vile crest who had come before him. The boy's eyes swept the darkening street with the idle curiosity of a child who trusted the world to be safe, and they found him, standing in the shadows, wide, gray, sharp, and utterly unafraid. Theron's eyes, his exact eyes, staring back at him from the face of a child he had never known existed. "Mama," the boy said, tugging at the woman's sleeve. The woman turned. Her gaze found Theron, and every trace of color drained from her face. He watched the recognition hit her like a physical blow, watched her body go rigid, watched her hands move instinctively to pull the child behind her. She rose slowly from her knees, placing herself between the boy and the alley, between the boy and Theron, between the boy and everything in the world that might try to take him from her, please. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty, please." She was shaking, not the tremble of someone caught in a lie, but the full-body terror of a mother who believed her child was about to be ripped from her arms. By him, she was afraid of him. Theron opened his mouth to speak, and no sound came. His chest felt like it had been cracked open with a blunt instrument. His wolf surged forward so violently, he nearly staggered, every instinct howling mine and protect. "And how and why and where have you been?" The boy peered around the woman's hip, those gray eyes, curious and steady and completely fearless. "Mama, why is the tall man staring at us?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Theron had ever heard. 2 weeks earlier, Sable had been invisible, and she had preferred it that way. She had worked in the Ashenmere Palace for 13 months, moving through its corridors the way water moved through stone, filling the cracks no one bothered to look at. She scrubbed flagstone floors before dawn. She dusted chandeliers that held more candles than her entire cottage had rooms. She folded linens with corners so precise that the head steward had once held one up as an example to the newer staff, though he had not bothered to learn her name when he did it. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant Wren was safe. Every morning before the sun cleared the rooftops, Sable kissed her sleeping son's forehead and left him with Britta, the elderly seamstress 3 doors down, whose hands shook too badly now to thread a needle, but whose voice could calm a tantrum at 40 paces. Britta never asked questions. She never asked why a young woman with a healer's training was scrubbing palace floors instead of working in an infirmary. She never asked about the boy's father or the mark Sable kept hidden beneath her collar. She simply opened her door every morning at dawn and handed Wren back every evening with a report on what he had eaten, what he had drawn, and which neighborhood cats he had attempted to befriend. Every evening, Sable walked home through the lower quarter, counting the streets as they narrowed and the buildings as they sagged, until she reached the cottage at the end of the lane. She unlocked the door, and the moment Wren crashed into her legs, she breathed for the first time all day. The palace was a beautiful, terrible place. Beautiful, because the architecture alone could make a person weep, soaring arches and stained glass that threw colored light across the marble floors like scattered jewels. Terrible because the man who ruled from its center was the reason Sable could not sleep through a single night without waking in a cold sweat. She had never spoken to the king, had never been in the same room with him for longer than the handful of seconds it took to replace a water pitcher or remove a dinner tray while keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, but she knew his presence the way prey knew a predator. She could feel him enter a corridor before she saw him. Her body reacted before her mind caught up, pulse climbing, skin prickling, every instinct screaming at her to run. It was not hatred. It was not even fear exactly. It was something far worse. Something she had spent 5 years refusing to name, and 5 years before that not knowing existed. King Theron Veilcrest had been on the throne for 6 years. He had won the Ashwood Rebellion through a combination of ruthless strategy and physical dominance that had become the stuff of legend and nightmare in equal measure. He was tall enough to make door frames feel insufficient, broad across the shoulders in a way that made the ceremonial armor he wore at court look like it had been forged around him rather than fitted. His reputation preceded him into every room and lingered long after he left. But the rumors that interested the servants most were not about his strength or his temper. They were about the shadows beneath his eyes that never seemed to fade. The way he stood at windows and stared at nothing. The way he flinched, just barely, whenever someone mentioned the final siege at Ashwood. The one that had ended the rebellion and killed more civilians than soldiers on both sides. The palace whispered that the king carried the dead with him, and Sable believed it because she had seen the look in his eyes once across a torchlit tent in a village called Venmore, and that look had been the beginning of everything she was now running from. The court wanted him mated. The council brought it up in every session, according to the servants who overheard and spread the gossip like fire through dry brush. 6 years without an heir was a vulnerability. The bloodline needed securing. The nobles were restless, and the king, they said, refused every offer without explanation. Sable heard these conversations and pressed her nails into her palms until the sting anchored her. She was invisible. She would stay invisible. And then, on a cold Tuesday morning, in the middle of her second winter at the palace, she stopped being invisible. It was her fault. She should not have been anywhere near the king's private study. Her assignment was the east corridor, the guest chambers that sat empty 9 months of the year, and accumulated dust with remarkable enthusiasm. But one of the senior maids had taken ill, and the head steward had reassigned Sable to the royal wing for the day without ceremony or warning. She had been polishing the brass handles on the study door when the voices inside became loud enough to penetrate the thick oak. 3, maybe 4 men, arguing. 6 years without a mate, Your Majesty. The houses are losing patience. Let them lose it. That voice, low, flat, edged with the kind of authority that did not require volume. Sable's hands stilled on the brass. The Thornwall delegation has offered 3 eligible daughters. The Grey Hollow contingent has 2. All of impeccable lineage. If you would simply agree to receive them. I said no, sire. The realm requires an heir. Without one, the succession is vulnerable to exactly the kind of challenge that started the Ashwood conflict in the first place. A silence followed, dense enough that Sable could feel its weight through the door. She should not be here. She should not be listening. She pressed the cloth against the handle and began to back away. Her elbow caught the edge of a wall sconce. The metal bracket shrieked against stone. The sound cut through the corridor like a blade. The study door opened. Sable froze. The polishing cloth clutched in both hands, her heart slamming against her ribs. The man standing in the doorway was Halric, the king's beta. He looked at her with mild surprise, then glanced over his shoulder. "A maid," Halric said. "Polishing." There was a pause, then movement behind the beta, and King Theron appeared in the doorway. He was closer than Sable had ever been to him, close enough to see the exact shade of gray in his eyes, dark at the edges and pale near the center, like storm clouds breaking. Close enough to see the tension locked in his jaw and the hollows carved beneath his cheekbones that spoke of too many late nights and not enough rest. Close enough to catch his scent, and the moment it hit her, her wolf slammed against her ribs so hard she nearly gasped. His gaze landed on her and stopped. Sable's lungs forgot how to work. Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker, barely perceptible, like a match struck in a dark room that caught and died in the same instant. His nostrils flared slightly, and his head tilted by a fraction of a degree, the way a wolf's might when catching an unexpected scent on the wind. For 2 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then Sable dropped her gaze to the floor, dipped into the deepest curtsy her trembling legs could manage, and whispered, "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I did not mean to disturb." She rose, turned, and walked away as calmly as her body would allow. She made it to the end of the corridor before her composure cracked, and she broke into a run. Behind her, Theron stood in the doorway of his study, staring at the empty space where she had been. His hand gripped the doorframe hard enough to leave marks in the wood. "Halric," he said quietly. "Sire?" "The maid who was just here. Find out everything about her." Halric's report arrived the following morning, and it contained almost nothing. Sable Voss, hired 13 months ago through the lower kitchens, transferred to housekeeping after 3 weeks. No family listed in the palace registry, no prior employment record, no village of origin on file. The head steward describes her as quiet, reliable, and entirely unremarkable. Theron read the report twice. The words sat wrong. Not because they were suspicious, but because they were hollow. A person did not simply appear from nowhere, with no history and no ties, and manage to be entirely unremarkable for over a year. People like that were not unremarkable. They were hiding. "That is everything?" Theron asked. "That is everything the records show," Halric replied carefully. "Shall I dig deeper?" Theron set the report down on his desk and stared at it. He could still smell her. That was the part that made no sense, the part that had kept him pacing his chambers past midnight, like something caged, his wolf clawing at the walls of his control, with a ferocity he had not felt since the war. Her scent had lodged itself somewhere beneath his conscious awareness, and refused to leave. It was not perfume or soap. It was something underneath those things, warm and clean, and threaded through with lavender and something earthen. Something he could not identify but that his wolf recognized, with a certainty that bordered on violence. He had smelled it before. He knew he had. The memory hovered just beyond reach, tangled up in smoke and blood, and a night he had spent years trying not to think about. "Not yet," Theron said. "Just keep an eye on her for now." Halric hesitated in the doorway. "May I ask why?" No. The truth was that Theron did not know why. Or rather, he did know, and the knowing terrified him. Because the last time he had felt this pull, this maddening, bone-deep gravity toward another person, he had been standing in a healer's tent, in a village called Venmore, with the blood of the Ashwood siege still under his fingernails, and a young woman with steady hands and exhausted eyes had looked at him like he was just a man. Not a king, not a weapon, just a man who was tired. He had searched for her afterward, for weeks. The village said she had left before dawn. No forwarding address, no trace. And he had let her go, because letting her go had felt like the only decent thing he had ever done. He was not a man who deserved to keep good things. The dead of Ashwood had taught him that. Sable, meanwhile, had entered a state of controlled panic. She had been seen. Worse, she had been noticed. And by the one person in the entire kingdom who could never, under any circumstances, look at her too closely. She went to the head steward that afternoon and requested reassignment back to the East Corridor. The steward granted it without question. She was, after all, entirely unremarkable. But the damage was done. Over the following days, Sable became aware of the king's presence in places he should not have been. The lower gallery, where she polished the floor on Wednesday mornings. The library annex, where she dusted the reading lamps on Thursday afternoons. The servants' corridor near the kitchens, where no king had any reason to walk. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself he was not watching her. But her wolf knew better. Her wolf, dormant and buried for almost 5 years, had begun to stir in a way that made Sable feel like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. She had buried that wolf so deep, she had almost forgotten it existed. During the 4 years between Venmore and the palace, she had learned to silence it. 4 years of surviving alone in distant villages where no one knew her name, picking up work wherever she could find it. She had gutted fish on the coast of Heron, standing in the freezing wind for 12 hours a day, with her belly growing rounder and her back aching, and no one to ask if she was all right. She had washed laundry in Crestfall until her hands cracked and bled, wrapping them in strips of cloth at night, while Wren slept in a basket beside the washboard. She had given birth to Wren in a rented room, above a bakery in Millhaven, with only the baker's wife to hold her hand, and she had wept with a joy and a terror so intertwined she could not tell where one ended and the other began. She had named him Wren, because he was small and fierce, and his cry was the loudest thing she had ever heard, and because wrens were survivors. They built their nests in impossible places and raised their young against all odds, and sang in the morning, even when the world gave them no reason to. Every choice she had made since that night in Venmore had been in service of one thing: keeping Wren invisible, keeping them both invisible, because the alternative, being found, being known, being seen by the man whose bite mark she still hid beneath high collars and pinned hair, was not an option she could survive. She started altering her routes, took different staircases, swapped duties with other maids when she could manage it without raising questions. She ate her midday meal in a supply closet rather than the servants' hall, because the hall shared a wall with the lower courtyard, and twice now she had sensed him passing on the other side of it. On the 5th day, she slipped and dropped an entire tray of crystal glasses outside the banquet hall. The sound was catastrophic. Glass exploded across the marble floor in a glittering spray that brought 3 servants running. Sable knelt in the wreckage, hands shaking, picking up shards with fingers that would not stop trembling. A shadow fell across the floor. She did not look up. She did not need to. "You are bleeding," the king said. His voice was closer than it should have been. Sable stared at her hand and realized he was right. A thin line of red ran from her palm, where a shard had bitten into the skin. She had not felt it. "It is nothing, Your Majesty," she said to the floor. A beat of silence. She could feel his gaze on the top of her head, heavy and searching. She could feel her wolf pressing forward under her skin, straining toward him with a desperate, aching pull that threatened to crack her open from the inside. "Have it looked at," he said. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and the air rushed back into the space he had occupied, like it had been holding its breath too. Sable did not move for a long time. That evening she left the palace through the servants' gate. As the sun dipped below the western wall, she walked quickly, her injured hand wrapped in a strip of linen, her pulse beating a rhythm that had not slowed since morning. She needed to get home, needed to see Wren, needed to hold her son and remind herself why she had survived this long, why she had come back to this city, why she endured the daily torture of breathing the same air as a man she could never, ever allow herself to want. She had come back to Ashemere because she had run out of options. 4 years of running had drained her savings to nothing. Wren needed stability. He needed a real home, not another rented room in another forgettable town. And the palace paid well, hired without questions, and was the last place anyone would expect to find a woman who was hiding from the king. It had been the most reckless decision of her life, and for 13 months it had worked. Until now, she did not notice the figure following her through the lower quarter. She did not notice the footsteps matching her pace from 3 streets back, moving with the trained silence of a predator who had spent years stalking far more dangerous prey. She reached the cottage, knocked twice, paused, then once more. The latch lifted from inside. Ren was there, standing in the doorway in his threadbare sleeping shirt, barefoot, clutching the wooden figure he had been carving with a butter knife. It was supposed to be a wolf. It looked more like a potato with legs, and Sable loved it so fiercely her chest hurt. "Mama!" He launched himself at her legs, and Sable caught him and held on with both arms, pressing her face into his hair. "Are you good for Britta?" she asked, though the answer did not matter. She just needed to hear his voice, needed the solid, warm proof of him. "I was the best," Ren declared, wriggling free to demonstrate something involving the wooden wolf and a complicated battle against invisible enemies. Behind them, at the edge of the lamplight, the king stood very still. Sable sensed him before Ren spoke. The bond, the one she had spent 5 years pretending did not exist, flared to life in her chest like a struck match. "Mama," Ren said, pausing mid-battle. "There is a man." Sable turned. Every drop of blood in her body went cold. King Theron stood at the boundary where the lamplight met the dark. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were not on her. They were locked on Ren. On the boy's face. On the jaw and the brow and the gray eyes and the dark hair that fell in exactly the wrong direction. She watched the recognition hit him. It moved through his body, like a shockwave, starting in his eyes, traveling down through his shoulders, his hands, his knees. His entire frame went rigid and the color left his face, and his hands curled into fists at his sides, so tight the knuckles went white. "How old is he?" Theron asked. His voice was barely a whisper. Sable pulled Ren behind her, shielding him with her body. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Every answer was a confession, and every confession was a door she could never close again. "Sable." The king's voice cracked on her name. "How old is he?" "Go inside, sweetheart," Sable managed, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. "Find Britta. Tell her Mama needs a moment." Ren studied the stranger with those unsettling gray eyes, suspicious and curious in equal measure. Then he disappeared inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click that felt deafening. Theron had not moved. He stood in the lamplight like something carved from stone, his gaze still fixed on the space where the boy had been. When he finally spoke, his voice came out raw and fractured. "He is mine." It was not a question. Sable's nails bit into her palms. "He is mine," she corrected, and the fierce animal certainty in her own voice surprised her. "He has always been mine." Theron's jaw worked. The muscle beneath the skin jumped once, twice. "How?" Sable almost laughed. "Almost. I think you know how. That is not what I meant." His eyes found hers, and the pain in them nearly sent her to the ground. "How did I not know? How did you keep this from me for 4 years? How are you, standing in my palace every single day, breathing the same air as me, and I did not know I had a son?" The word hit the air like a stone, dropped into still water. "Son." Sable felt it ripple through her body. "Because you were never supposed to know," she said. That was the entire point. Theron moved toward her, and she stepped back. He stopped immediately. The hurt that crossed his face was so naked, it made her stomach clench. Let it hurt. It could not possibly hurt as much as the last 5 years had hurt her. "Sable," his voice had dropped to something barely audible. "Tell me what happened." She did not want to. The memories lived in a locked room inside her chest, and opening that door meant letting in light that would illuminate every terrible, lonely, aching thing she had survived. But the king was standing in front of her cottage at nightfall, and her son's face had already told him everything. Her mouth had refused to. "Venmore," she said. "The village at the edge of the Ashwood. 5 years ago during the campaign." Recognition hit him. She watched it land. "You were the healer's apprentice," he said slowly. "The one who treated the wounded after the river crossing." I treated your wounded, Sable corrected. Your soldiers who would have bled out in the mud if someone had not packed their wounds and held them together through the night. Theron's expression shifted. I remember. I came to thank the healers personally. There was a woman, young. She would not look at me. His voice trailed off. That was you. That was me. And the night after, the woman who stayed awake when everyone else had gone. The one who talked to me like I was a person instead of a title. The one who... He stopped. The memory found him fully, and she watched the blood drain from his face for the second time that evening. Yes, Sable whispered. That was also me. One night the battle had been won, the village saved, and Sable had been running on 3 days without sleep, and the desperate, reckless relief of still being alive. He had come to the healer's tent, and she had been the only one still awake. Her hands stained with the blood of men she had stitched together by candlelight, her mind too exhausted to remember that the man sitting across from her was a king. They had talked. Not about the war, not about the dead or the wounded or the mourning that would bring more of both. They had talked about small, useless, wonderful things. The way the stars looked different from the Ashwood Ridge. The herbs that grew in the riverbank mud, that nobody else bothered to harvest. Whether cats were actually as indifferent as they pretended to be, or if it was all a very elaborate act. She had forgotten to be afraid of him, because exhaustion had burned away every filter she possessed, and he had looked at her like she was the only real thing, in a world gone mad with violence. Like she had reminded him that real things still existed. They had not meant for it to happen. Neither of them had planned it, or expected it, or even understood it. But somewhere between the talking and the silence, and the unbearable weight of surviving together, his hand had found hers, and hers had not pulled away, and the world had narrowed to the two of them in the firelight. And before dawn, still half asleep, and wrapped in the warmth of each other, his wolf had surfaced. He had pressed his mouth to the curve of her neck and bitten down, and the pain had been sharp and sweet, and followed by a warmth that flooded through her entire body like sunrise. She had bitten him back on instinct, her teeth finding the hollow of his throat, and something had locked into place between them with an almost audible click. Neither of them had understood what it meant. Not then. She had only learned later, months later, when the mark refused to fade and her wolf refused to settle, and a healer in a village 300 miles from Venmore had explained with wide eyes what a mating bite was and what it meant. You left, Theron said. Before morning I searched the village for days. They said you had gone. I left because I had to. Why? Sable closed her eyes. The truth tasted like iron on her tongue. Because your chancellor came to me before dawn. Aldrich found me while you were still sleeping. He told me that the king's bloodline could not be tainted by a village, nobody with dirt under her fingernails. He told me that if I was still in the village when you woke, he would make sure I disappeared in a way that was permanent. The silence that followed was catastrophic. Theron's entire body had gone still, in a way that was no longer human. His eyes had darkened, the pale centers swallowed by something predatory, something that belonged to the wolf and not the man. When he spoke, his voice was so low it vibrated in her chest. Aldrich told you this. He gave me money and told me to go far away and never come back. I was 19. I was terrified. So I went. And you were pregnant. I did not know yet. Not until weeks later when the sickness started and the mark on my neck would not fade, and my wolf howled every night for something I could not give her. Theron turned away from her. His hands were shaking. She could see the tremor running through his shoulders, and she could not tell if it was rage or grief, or both. If he were still alive, Theron said, and the words came out with a calm, measured fury that was more terrifying than shouting, I would make him answer for every single day you spent alone. He is already gone, Sable replied quietly. The fever took him 2 winters ago. Theron stood with his back to her, his head bowed. The lamplight caught the rigid line of his spine, the white of his knuckles where his fists pressed against his thighs. She watched him breathe through it, slow and deliberate, the controlled rhythm of a man trying very hard not to shift into something with claws. When he turned back to her, his eyes were wet. I need to see him, He said, "Please. I need to see my son." The word again, my son. It carved through Sable's chest and left something raw and bleeding in its wake. "Not tonight," she said, and it took every scrap of courage she had to deny him this. "He does not know who you are. He does not know who his father is. I will not have you walk into his life like an earthquake and shatter everything I have built to keep him safe." Theron stared at her, and she could see the war raging behind his eyes. The king in him wanted to command. The wolf in him wanted to claim. But something else, something deeper and quieter, looked at the woman standing between him and his child, with her chin raised and her hands trembling, and recognized that she had earned the right to set the terms. "Then, tell me what you need," he said. The arrangement was supposed to be careful, controlled. Theron would visit twice a week. Short visits, always at the cottage, always on Sable's terms. No titles, no guards, no mention of the palace. To Wren, the tall man with the gray eyes was simply a friend of his mother's. Nothing more. The first visit was a disaster. Theron arrived at the cottage door in common clothes, which on him looked about as convincing as a war horse wearing a saddle blanket and pretending to be a pony. He stood in the cramped front room and looked around at the low ceiling, the patched furniture, the shelf of mismatched jars filled with dried herbs, and his expression cycled through something complicated that Sable chose not to examine. Wren sat on the floor beside the hearth, his wooden wolf balanced on his knee, watching the stranger with open suspicion. "Hello," Theron said. His voice was stiff, formal. He sounded like he was addressing a foreign dignitary rather than a 4-year-old boy. Wren stared at him. "You were the man from before. Yes, you made Mama cry." Theron's face went through a series of rapid transformations. Shock, guilt, pain, and finally something stripped bare that he smothered immediately. But Sable caught it and felt her own chest constrict. "I did not mean to," Theron said quietly. "You should say sorry," Wren informed him. Theron looked at Sable. The vulnerability in his expression was so foreign on a face she associated with authority and control that it made her throat tight. "He is right," Sable said. "You should." "I am sorry," Theron said. He held her gaze when he said it, and she understood he was not just apologizing for the other night. Wren considered this with the gravity of a small judge weighing evidence, then held up the wooden wolf. "Do you want to see my wolf? I made it myself. His name is Fenris, and he is very dangerous." Theron lowered himself to the floor. The sight of the Alpha King sitting cross-legged on a threadbare rug, holding a lopsided wooden potato wolf with the solemnity of a man inspecting a battle plan, would have been comical if it had not made Sable want to weep. "Fenris is an excellent name," Theron said gravely. "He bites," Wren added, making the wolf lunge at Theron's hand, with accompanying sound effect. "I would expect nothing less," Theron replied, and Wren grinned at him with an openness that took Sable's breath away. The boy had never smiled at a man like that before. He had never had a man to smile at. The visits continued. Twice a week became 3 times, then 4. Sable told herself she was allowing it for Wren's sake, because her son deserved to know his father, even if that father could never publicly acknowledge him. She told herself the warmth that bloomed in her chest when she watched them together, with simple maternal satisfaction, nothing more. She was lying, and she knew it. Theron was different in the cottage. Stripped of his title, and his armor, and his council of advisors, he became someone she had only glimpsed once before, during that single night in Venmore, when exhaustion had burned away all his defenses. He listened when Wren talked, really listened, with the kind of focused attention that made the boy beam. He learned that Wren was afraid of thunderstorms, and that his favorite food was honeycakes, and that he believed with absolute conviction that the moon was an egg, and something magnificent was going to hatch from it one day. "What do you think will hatch?" Theron asked one evening, stretched out on the floor while Wren sat on his chest, like it was a throne. "A wolf," Wren said. "The biggest wolf anyone has ever seen. Bigger than the palace." "That is going to cause some problems," Theron observed. "Good problems," Wren corrected, poking Theron's nose for emphasis. Theron caught the small hand and pretended to bite the fingers, and Wren shrieked with laughter so pure and bright that Sable had to turn away and press her knuckles against her mouth. On another visit, Wren decided the tall man needed a tour of the cottage. This consisted of the boy leading Theron solemnly from room to room, pointing out each feature as though presenting a grand estate. "This is the kitchen," Wren announced. "Mama burns things in here sometimes." "I do not burn things," Sable called from the other room. "She burned the porridge yesterday," Wren whispered to Theron conspiratorially. "I heard that," Sable said. "This is my room," Wren continued, pushing open the narrow door. The room was barely larger than a closet. A small bed, a shelf with 3 battered books, and a collection of interesting rocks, and a drawing pinned to the wall in charcoal that depicted what appeared to be a wolf standing on the moon. "That is Fenris," Wren explained, pointing at the drawing. "He hatched from the moon, and now he guards it. He does not let bad things come at night." Theron studied the drawing for a long time. "Does Fenris always keep the bad things away?" he asked, and his voice was careful, the way a person's voice gets when they are asking about something much bigger than a drawing. Wren considered this. "Mostly. Sometimes Mama has to do it instead. She checks under the bed and in the cupboard and behind the door. She says there is nothing there, but she checks anyway, because that is what Mamas do." Theron glanced at Sable in the doorway. Something passed between them in that look, heavy and tender and suffused with all the years he had not been there to check under the bed. "Your mama is very brave," Theron said. "I know," Wren agreed simply. "She is the bravest person in the whole world." Sable pressed her back against the corridor wall where neither of them could see her face. Another evening, she found them asleep, together, on the rug in front of the hearth. Wren was curled on Theron's chest, his face pressed against the man's neck, one small fist gripping the collar of Theron's shirt. Theron's arm was curved protectively around the boy, and his face in sleep was more peaceful than Sable had ever seen it. The lines of tension that she had come to think of as permanent had softened, and for the first time, she could see the man he might have been if the war had not carved so much of him away. She covered them with a blanket and sat in the chair by the fire and watched them breathe, and felt the walls she had spent 5 years building crack a little deeper. One evening, after Wren had fallen asleep, Theron lingered. He sat at the kitchen table, turning an empty cup between his hands, and the silence between them shifted into something charged and fragile. "He is remarkable," Theron said. "He is," Sable agreed. "You have done this alone." For almost 5 years. The way he said it, quiet and devastated, made something ache behind her ribs. "I should have been there," Theron continued, his jaw tightening. "I should have found you. I should have torn the kingdom apart looking. Instead he paused, and the pain that crossed his face was old and deep and had nothing to do with her. "Instead I spent 5 years punishing myself for the war, and using the guilt as an excuse not to feel anything." Sable set her cup down carefully. She had not expected him to say that. The raw honesty of it cut through every defense she had. "The council thinks I refuse to mate because I am stubborn," Theron continued, staring at his hands. "Because I am difficult or proud or arrogant. They do not know that I refuse because I have not felt worthy of it. Not since Ashwood." He paused. "There were civilians in the final siege, families. They were not supposed to be there. Intelligence said the settlement had been evacuated, but it had not. And by the time we realized, it was too late." His voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of a man reciting something he had told himself 1,000 times in the dark. "How many?" Sable asked softly. 43. Men, women, children." He swallowed hard. "Every single face. I remember every single one." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of something that could not be undone. "You did not let me vanish," Sable said finally. "Your chancellor made me vanish. And I stayed vanished because I believed it was the only way to keep Wren safe." "Safe from what?" Theron asked, and there was an edge to his voice now, a current of barely contained fury that was not directed at her. "From the court? From the politics? From me?" Sable met his eyes. An illegitimate child with the king's face is not a gift, your majesty. It is a target. The title landed between them like a wall. Theron flinched. Do not call me that, he said quietly. Not here. Not when we are talking about our son. Our son. The two words split something open inside her, that she had kept sealed for years. Her eyes burned. She looked away and pressed her palms flat against the table, needing the solidity of it to keep from falling apart. Sable. He reached across the table, his hand stopping, just short of hers, hovering, waiting. Let me protect you both. Come to the palace. Let me give him the life he deserves. And what life is that? Sable asked, pulling her hand into her lap. The king's secret? Kept in a comfortable cage, instead of a cramped one? He recoiled like she had struck him. That is not what I am offering. Then what are you offering? Because you cannot acknowledge him, Theron. An illegitimate child with the king's face and no noble blood would tear the court apart. The houses would use him as leverage. Every faction that opposes you would have a weapon handed to them wrapped in a blanket. The truth of it hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. Theron stared at the table, his hands flat against the wood, and for the first time since she had known him, the king looked completely and utterly lost. I will find a way, he said. There is no way. Then I will make one. He looked up, and his eyes burned with a conviction that frightened her because she wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe it so badly it felt like a wound. I will not lose him again. I will not lose either of you. The fire crackled somewhere in the next room, Wren murmured in his sleep. Sable pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed through the ache in her throat. When she lowered her hands, Theron was watching her with an expression so raw and open. It made the air between them feel like it was made of glass. You should go, she whispered. Before I say something, I cannot take back. He stood slowly, moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and turned back to look at her one last time. I am not going to give up, he said. I need you to know that. He left. The door closed. Sable put her head down on the table and wept. The trouble began with a rumor. Sable heard it first from Marin, one of the laundry maids, who had heard it from a footman who had overheard it from a member of the Thornwall delegation. The king had been seen in the lower quarter multiple times, always in the evening, always alone, always heading in the same direction. They say he has a woman down there, Marin whispered over the washing basins. Some secret lover he visits after dark. Sable's hands went still in the soapy water. Her pulse became a roaring thing in her ears. Probably just gossip, she managed. Probably, Marin agreed cheerfully. But Lord Cassius was asking questions at breakfast. You know how he is. If there is a weakness to exploit, that man will sniff it out like a bloodhound, Lord Cassius Thornwall. The name alone made Sable's blood run cold. He was the head of the most powerful noble house in the realm, a man who had been positioning his eldest daughter as the future queen for the better part of 3 years. He was patient, ruthless, and deeply invested in controlling the succession. If he discovered that the king had an unacknowledged son with a servant, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not for the king. King survived scandal. For Wren. Sable left the laundry room as soon as she could manage it without raising suspicion. Her first thought was Wren. She needed to make sure he was safe. That Cassius's people had not already found the cottage. That no one had come asking questions about the boy with the gray eyes and the dark hair who played in the alley with a wooden wolf. She changed out of her palace uniform, stuffed her belongings into the cloth bag she kept in her locker for emergencies, the bag she had never fully unpacked, because part of her had always known this day would come, and left through the servants' gate. She walked fast, then faster, then broke into a run, her heart hammering against her ribs with every step. The lower quarter had never felt so exposed. Every stranger's glance became a threat. Every unfamiliar face could be one of Cassius's scouts. She found herself checking behind her every few strides, looking for anyone who moved with too much purpose, anyone who seemed to be watching the cottage at the end of the lane. Britta was not at the cottage when she arrived. A note, pinned to the door in the old woman's shaky hand, read, "Taken Wren to the market. Back before dark." The market. The public, crowded, wide-open market, where Wren's face would be visible to anyone who cared to look. Sable's knees nearly gave out. She gripped the doorframe and forced herself to breathe. Britta did not know. Britta had no idea that the boy she was walking through the market stalls was the most politically dangerous child in the kingdom. Sable stood in the empty cottage and felt fear settle into her bones like winter damp. The market was public. Wren's face was public. Anyone looking for a child who resembled the king would find him in an instant. She had to warn Theron. She had to tell him that his visits had been noticed, that the very thing she had feared was already beginning to unfold. But going to the king directly was impossible. A servant did not simply walk into the royal wing and request an audience. The social distance between them was as real as any wall, and crossing it would only confirm the rumors. Halric found her instead. The beta appeared in the servants' corridor the next morning, with an expression that told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "We have a problem," Halric said. He led her to a small room off the main hallway, windowless and private, and closed the door behind them. "Lord Cassius has dispatched people to the lower quarter. They are asking about the king's movements. Descriptions of the cottage have already surfaced. It is only a matter of time before they connect it to you." Sable's stomach plummeted. "How much time?" "Days, perhaps less. Then I need to leave. Take Wren and disappear before they connect us to the king." Halric shook his head. "The king will not allow that. The king does not get to decide." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Wren's safety comes before everything. Before the king's feelings, before the bond, before any of it." The word slipped out before she could catch it, and it hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire she could not take back. The beta regarded her with an expression she could not read. "You said bond." Sable closed her eyes. "Does the king know?" Halric asked carefully. "That you share a mate bond with him?" The directness of it stole her breath. She had spent 5 years burying this truth so deep, she had almost convinced herself it did not exist. But her wolf had always known. From the first moment in Venmore, from the first touch, the first breath of his scent, her wolf had known what he was to her, and had been howling in the silence ever since. "It does not matter," Sable said. "A bond does not change politics. A bond does not protect a 4-year-old boy from being used as a pawn. A bond changes everything," Halric replied quietly. "And the king already suspects. He has been different since he found the boy. Distracted, agitated. He paces his chambers at night. He growls at anyone who mentions the Thornwall marriage proposal. Last night, he nearly shifted during a council meeting when Cassius suggested that the crown's future required noble blood." Sable felt the ground shifting beneath her. "Bring them to the palace," Halric urged. "Both of you. We can protect you behind these walls." "The palace is where the danger lives," Sable shot back. "The danger is already at your door," Halric countered. "At least here. You are behind stone. Out there, you are exposed. And so is the boy." She wanted to argue. Every instinct she had built over 5 years of survival screamed at her to grab Wren and run, to vanish into another village, another name, another life. She had done it before. She could do it again. But a part of her, the part connected to the man she had been running from since Venmore, the part that ached every time she hid the mark on her neck, knew Halric was right. Running again would not keep Wren safe. It would only delay the reckoning, and she was so tired of running. That evening, Theron came to the cottage. Sable met him at the door before he could knock. "You cannot come here anymore," she said. "Cassius has people watching." Saren's expression hardened. "I know," Halric told me. "Then you understand. This has to stop. This is not stopping." His voice brooked no argument. "You and Wren are coming to the palace tonight. Theron, listen to me." "No." He stepped closer, and the proximity sent a shock wave through her body. She could feel the bond thrumming between them. Feel it pulling, aching, demanding. "I have already lost 4 years. I have already missed his first word, his first step, every nightmare I should have chased away and every morning I should have been there for. I will not lose another day." His eyes held hers, and the raw desperation in them, stripped away every argument she had prepared. If Cassius finds out about Ren, he continued, his voice dropping low and fierce, he will not come to me first. He will go to the council. He will use the boy as proof that I am unfit to rule, that I have been hiding an illegitimate heir while refusing noble matches. He will demand that Ren be removed from your custody and placed under the protection of the court, which means under his control. The blood left Sable's face. He would not dare. He would. And the council would let him because half of them already think I am too volatile to lead, and the other half are waiting for exactly this kind of leverage. Sable's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her stomach and tried to breathe. What would happen to him? She whispered. To Ren. Theron's expression broke. I do not know. And that terrifies me more than anything I have ever faced in my life. More than the rebellion. More than the siege. More than the 43 faces I see every time I close my eyes. She looked at the cottage behind her, the patched roof, the herb box in the window, the small, crumbling, stubborn world she had built with her bare hands and her refusal to need anyone. Inside, Ren was asleep in his narrow bed, with Fenris the potato wolf clutched against his chest, and his mouth open, and his dark hair fanned across the pillow in exactly the same way his father's probably did. Pack what you need, Theron said gently. I will carry him. Something broke inside her. Not the walls she had built, though those were crumbling too. Something older and harder and more exhausting than the walls. The brittle, lonely fiction that she could do this alone. That she had to do this alone. That needing help was the same as being weak. Sable nodded, and the tears came before she could stop them. Theron gathered Ren from his bed with a tenderness that would have undone her if she had not already been undone. The boy stirred, blinked, and looked up at the man holding him with bleary, trusting eyes. Are we going somewhere? Ren mumbled. Somewhere safe? Theron said, adjusting the boy against his shoulder with the careful, instinctive ease of someone whose arms had been built for exactly this purpose. Ren's small hand found the collar of Theron's shirt and gripped it. His eyes drifted closed. Within seconds, he was asleep again, his face pressed against his father's neck, completely unafraid. Theron looked at Sable over the boy's head, and what she saw in his face was not the king. It was not the wolf, or the warlord, or the man the realm whispered about in fear. It was a father holding his child for the first time, while his child slept, and the emotion pouring off him through the bond was so immense and so devastating that Sable had to press her hand over her mouth to keep silent. They left the cottage together in the dark. They did not look back. The palace swallowed them whole. Theron installed Sable and Ren in a set of rooms adjacent to his own chambers, connected by a door that he left unlocked. The rooms were beautiful in a way that made Sable uncomfortable. Thick carpets, heavy curtains, a fireplace, large enough for Ren to stand inside, and a bed so absurdly soft that the boy bounced on it for 10 solid minutes before declaring it acceptable. This bed is bigger than our whole house, Ren whispered, his eyes enormous. It is not our house, Sable said carefully. We are just staying here for a while. Like a holiday? Something like that. Can Fenris have a pillow? Sable looked at the wooden wolf in her son's hand. Fenris can have a pillow. Ren accepted this with the effortless adaptability of a child, and promptly arranged Fenris on the spare pillow with great ceremony before falling asleep in the center of the enormous bed with one arm draped protectively over his wool. Sable sat on the edge and watched him breathe, and tried not to feel like she had traded one cage for another. A soft knock on the connecting door. She opened it to find Theron standing in the frame, still dressed, his face tight with controlled tension. He is settled? Theron asked, his voice low enough not to carry. Asleep in 30 seconds. He thinks this is a holiday. She paused. He asked if Fenris could have a pillow. Something softened behind Theron's eyes. For a moment he looked like he might smile, and then the weight of everything else came crashing back in. There is something I need to tell you, he said. Sable's stomach clenched. Nothing good had ever followed those words, in her experience. Theron stepped into the room, and closed the door behind him. Cassius has called an emergency session of the council for tomorrow morning. He claims to have information about a threat to the succession. He has enough support among the houses to force a hearing. The floor seemed to pitch beneath her feet. Tomorrow? Already? He moves fast when he smells blood, Theron said grimly. His scouts must have found the cottage before we left. What will he say? He will present Wren's existence as evidence that I have been concealing an illegitimate heir while refusing to secure the bloodline through a sanctioned mating. He will argue that the boy represents an unsanctioned claim to the throne, and that leaving him in my care poses a danger to the realm. Theron's voice was steady, but she could feel the fury churning beneath the surface through the bond, hot and barely contained. He will demand that the council assume guardianship of Wren until the matter is resolved. The words landed like blows. Sable pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. They cannot take him, she said. He is 4 years old. He does not even know what a throne is. He thinks the moon is an egg. I know. Then stop them. You are the king. Command them. Theron's jaw tightened. If I overrule the council by force, it confirms everything Cassius has been saying. That I am too dangerous, too volatile, too willing to use power to protect my personal interests at the expense of the realm. It is the same argument they made before the Ashwood campaign, and I proved them right at the siege. The guilt was there again, woven through every word, embedded so deeply, she could feel it through the bond like a bruise that never faded. And if you do not overrule them? Sable asked. The silence that followed was its own answer. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her legs refusing to hold her. So either you look like a tyrant and they take him, or you look weak and they take him. There is a third option. Theron's voice had gone very quiet. A mate bond, formally declared and recognized by the court, legitimizes any offspring born before the declaration. It is old law, rarely invoked, but it exists. If I claim you publicly as my mate before the council, Wren becomes my legitimate heir. Cassius loses his leverage entirely. Sable's breath stopped. The room contracted around her. You want to claim me, she said slowly. In front of the entire court, a servant. A woman with no name, no house, no noble blood. You have a name. You have blood. And you are not a servant. He crossed the room and lowered himself to his knees, in front of her, and the sight of the Alpha King kneeling stole every thought from her head. You are the mother of my son. You are the woman who survived alone for 5 years to protect him. You are the strongest person I have ever known, and I am asking you, not commanding, asking, to let me stand beside you tomorrow and tell them the truth. Sable stared down at him. His gray eyes were open and unguarded in a way she had never seen, stripped bare of every wall and every title and every defense, and the bond between them was blazing so fiercely she could feel it in her teeth. They will destroy you, she whispered. The noble houses will revolt. Cassius will use this to turn half the court against you. Let him try. You could lose your throne. I have already lost 4 years of my son's life, and 5 years of yours. I will not lose anything else that matters to me. He paused. The throne does not matter. The crown does not matter. You matter. Wren matters. Everything else is furniture. The tears came, and she did not fight them. They spilled down her cheeks, hot and relentless, and she did not wipe them away because her hands were suddenly in his. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers so tightly she could feel his pulse hammering. You are asking me to trust you, she said, her voice breaking. Do you understand how hard that is? The last time I trusted someone in this palace, I was threatened and exiled and left alone and pregnant in a village where I knew no one. I know, his voice cracked, and I will spend the rest of my life making that right if you let me. Theron. His name came out tangled with a sob. Say, yes, he whispered. She closed her eyes. Behind her, Wren murmured in his sleep, something about wolves, and the moon, and good problems. The sound cut through the last wall she had left. Yes, Sable said, but if they try to touch my son, I will burn this palace to the ground. Theron's smile was fierce and bright and full of teeth. I would expect nothing less. He stayed. Neither of them said he should. Neither of them said he should not. He sat in the chair beside the bed, while Sable lay down next to Wren, and the three of them existed in the same room for the first time, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. Sable listened to Wren's steady breathing, and Theron's occasional movement in the chair, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in 5 years. Not safety, exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. The faint, trembling outline of what safety might feel like if she ever allowed herself to reach for it. She fell asleep to the sound of Theron humming something low and tuneless that might have been a lullaby. And in the morning, when Wren woke and found the tall man asleep in the chair beside his bed, the boy simply climbed into his lap and went back to sleep. Theron's arms closed around him without waking, and his face, even in sleep, softened into something that looked like peace. Sable watched them from the pillow, these two people, who held her whole heart in their hands, and thought about the 5 years she had spent, convinced that this moment was impossible, that she did not deserve it, that wanting it was a weakness she could not afford. She had been wrong. Wanting this was not weakness. It was the bravest thing she had ever done. The council chamber was full. Every seat taken, every wall lined with observers, the air so thick with tension, it was difficult to breathe. Sable stood outside the heavy oak doors and listened to the muffled voices inside and tried to stop her hands from shaking. She was wearing borrowed clothes, a deep green dress that Halric had procured from somewhere, simple but well made, and her hair was pinned up in a style she had seen the noble women wear. She did not look like a servant. She did not feel like a queen, either. She felt like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, about to step off and hoping desperately that the fall would not kill her. Wren held her hand, dressed in clean clothes that fit him properly. For the first time in his life, he looked up at her with his father's eyes and frowned. "Mama, your hand is all sweaty." "I know, darling. Are you scared?" "Do not worry." He squeezed her fingers with the absolute confidence of a child who had never been given a reason to doubt that the world would cooperate. "I will protect you." Sable knelt and pulled him against her chest, holding on tight enough that he squeaked in protest. "I know you will," she whispered into his hair. She breathed him in, honey cakes, and sleep, and the faint cedar smell of the enormous bed, and let his solidity anchor her. The doors opened. Halric stood on the other side, his face composed but his eyes sharp with urgency. "It is time," he said. The walk down the center of the council chamber was the longest of Sable's life. She could feel every gaze in the room land on her and stay. The whispers rose like wind through dead leaves. She heard fragments as she passed. "The maid. Lower quarter. No lineage. The boy. Look at the boy. Look at his face." She gripped Wren's hand and kept her eyes forward. Theron sat at the head of the long table, and his gaze found hers the moment she entered. The relief that flooded his expression was so visceral she could feel it through the bond. Warm and fierce and aching, he rose from his chair. Lord Cassius Thornwall was already on his feet. He was a tall man, silver-haired and angular, with the polished cruelty of someone who had never needed to raise his voice, because his power spoke for him. His daughter sat behind him, beautiful and perfectly composed, watching the proceedings, with the detached interest of someone who had been promised a crown and did not intend to see that promise broken. "Your Majesty," Cassius said smoothly, "this emergency session was called to address a matter of succession. I now see the matter has walked through the door." His gaze swept over Sable and Wren with the detached assessment of a man appraising livestock. "Perhaps you would care to explain to this council why you have been concealing an illegitimate child while refusing every sanctioned match this body has proposed." The chamber fell silent. Every face turned to Theron. The king did not look at Cassius. He looked at Sable. "There is nothing illegitimate about my son," Theron said. His voice filled the room without effort, steady and absolute. "And there is nothing unsanctioned about his mother." The murmur that rippled through the council was electric. "Before this court, under the old law of Ashenmere, I declare Sable Voss as my mate." The words landed like stones in still water, and the ripples spread outward in every direction. The bond between us was formed 5 years ago in Venmore. It is real, it is sealed, and, under the old law, it legitimizes every claim our son holds to this throne. The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped against stone, and Cassius's composure cracked for the first time as crimson crept up his neck. "This is absurd," Cassius snarled, abandoning all pretense of civility. "She is a servant. A woman with no house, no standing, no verifiable ancestry. The old law requires a mate bond, and a bond requires proof. Where is the mark? Where is the bite? Where is any evidence that this woman is anything more than a convenient solution to an inconvenient scandal?" The question hung in the air. Sable felt every eye in the room lock onto her. This was the moment, the edge of the cliff. She thought of Ren, of his lopsided wooden wolf, and his theory about the moon and the way he had said, "I will protect you," outside those doors, with perfect unshakable faith. She thought of the night he was born, alone in a room above a bakery, holding him for the first time, and promising him that she would never let anything hurt him. She thought of every dawn she had faced without help, every floor she had scrubbed, every collar she had pinned high to hide the mark that proved she was more than what they saw. She was done being invisible. Sable released Ren's hand gently. "Stay right here, sweetheart," she murmured, and the boy nodded, watching her with those wide gray eyes that missed nothing. She stepped forward. "You want proof," she said, and her voice did not shake. It carried across the chamber, clear and strong, and edged with a fury that she had been carrying for 5 years. "I spent 5 years raising the king's son alone, in poverty, in silence, because a man in this palace threatened to make me disappear if I did not. Your former chancellor, Aldrich, came to me before dawn and paid me to vanish before the king woke because my blood was not noble enough for these halls." The silence that followed was absolute. "I scrubbed your floors," Sable continued, her gaze sweeping the council. "I emptied your hearths and changed your linens, and stood in your corridors while you walked past me like I was part of the furniture. I did that for 13 months, while my son waited for me at home every evening, and not one of you saw me. Not one of you knew my name." She turned to look at Cassius directly. "You want to know if the bond is real?" Sable reached up and unpinned her hair. It fell across her shoulders and she tilted her head, exposing the side of her neck. The mark was there, faded to silver, 5 years old, but unmistakable. The crescent imprint of an alpha's bite, seared into the skin at the junction of her throat and shoulder. She had hidden it every single day for 5 years, beneath high collars and pinned hair and the careful practiced invisibility of a woman who could not afford to be seen. She was done hiding. The council stared. Cassius went white. Theron moved. He crossed the chamber in 4 strides, and when he reached her, he did not hesitate. He tilted his head and pulled down the collar of his shirt, revealing the matching mark on his own neck. Smaller, paler, but identical in shape. The mark she had left on him 5 years ago in a healer's tent in Venmore, instinctive and claiming and deeper than either of them had understood at the time. "Proof enough," Theron said to Cassius. His voice was quiet and lethally calm. Lord Cassius Thornwall, for the first time in his long and calculating career, had nothing to say. His daughter's composed expression had fractured into something brittle and furious behind him. But Sable did not spare her a glance. She had not come here to compete with noble daughters. She had come here to protect her son. "The old law is clear," Halric said, stepping forward from his position by the wall. "A declared mate bond with physical proof legitimizes all offspring. The boy is the king's rightful heir. This hearing has no further basis." Cassius recovered faster than Sable had expected. The man's composure reassembled itself like armor clicking back into place, and when he spoke, his voice was smooth again, dangerous again. "A mark can be fabricated," Cassius said, addressing the council rather than Theron. "A scar on the neck is not proof of a bond. It is proof of a bite. Any wolf could have made it." The accusation landed in the chamber like a slap. Sable felt Theron go rigid beside her. felt the fury spike through the bond so sharply it made her teeth ache. Any wolf, Theron repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. The council must verify. Cassius pressed, sensing an opening. A bonded pair shares a link that can be tested. If the bond is genuine, they will react to each other's distress. If it is a fabrication, the woman will feel nothing. When the king is threatened, a murmur ran through the council. Several members nodded. The logic was sound and Cassius knew it. Then test it, Sable said. Every head in the room turned to her. Even Cassius looked startled. I said test it, Sable repeated. Whatever verification you need, do it now. I have nothing to hide. Not anymore. Theron started to speak, started to object, but Sable caught his eye and held his gaze, and what she communicated through the bond was fiercer than words. Trust me, you asked me to trust you. Now trust me. One of the elder counselors, a woman named Greta, with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes, rose from her seat. The traditional verification is simple, she said, her voice carrying the dry authority of someone who had been reading law books since before most of the council had been born. The bonded pair stands at opposite ends of the chamber. If a genuine bond exists, they will be unable to remain separated. The pull is biological, involuntary, and impossible to fake. Sable walked to the far wall. Theron remained where he stood. The distance between them stretched like a wire being pulled taut. The bond screamed. It screamed in her chest, and her stomach, and behind her eyes, and in the hollow of her throat where his mark lived. Every step she had taken away from him was agony, physical, visceral agony that had nothing to do with emotion, and everything to do with what they were to each other, at the most fundamental level. Across the room, Theron's hands were shaking. She could see the tendons standing out in his neck, could see the fight in his posture as he forced himself to stay still. His wolf was visible behind his eyes, frantic, clawing, howling. Enough, Greta said after 30 seconds. That felt like 30 hours. The bond is verified. I have never seen a stronger one. Sable walked back to Theron on legs that barely held her, and the moment she was close enough, his hand found hers, and gripped it so tightly the bones protested. She did not care. She gripped back just as hard. The murmurs shifted. Sable watched the faces around the table change, one by one, as the political math rearranged itself in real time. Cassius's leverage was gone. The scandal he had planned to weaponize had just become a love story with a legal precedent, and love stories were much harder to argue against in public. Wren tugged at Sable's hand. She looked down. The boy gazed up at her with a furrowed brow. Mama, why is everyone being so loud? Sable laughed. It came out wet and breathless and slightly unhinged, but it was real, and it was hers. Because grown-ups are very silly sometimes, darling. I know, Wren said with a resigned sigh that belonged to someone 3 times his age. He looked around the council chamber with mild disdain, then looked up at Theron. Is this where you work? Theron stared down at his son, and something in his face broke open. Not pain this time. Something brighter. Yes, he said, his voice rough. This is where I work. It is very noisy, Wren observed. You should get a quieter job. The king laughed. The sound broke across the silent chamber, like sunlight through storm clouds, startled and genuine, and so full of warmth, it transformed the room. Sable watched the counselors' faces shift, one by one, from shock to something that looked remarkably like reluctant, bewildered acceptance. The king was laughing, in the council chamber, over his 4-year-old son's career advice. Several of them had never heard the sound before. The court did not accept her all at once. There were whispers for months, stares that lingered too long, conversations that went quiet when she entered a room. Sable felt the weight of every one of them, and there were days when the old instinct to disappear, to make herself small and invisible and safe, nearly won. But Theron was there. Every morning, every evening, steady and fierce and stubbornly, unreasonably devoted in a way that made the whispers harder to sustain. They will adjust, he told her one night, his voice low against her hair as they lay together in the dark. And if they do not, Then they can take it up with their king, who happens to be unreasonably fond of his mate, and will remain so regardless of their opinions on the matter. Sable smiled against his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, slow and strong and peaceful in a way it had not been for years. The nightmares still came sometimes, the faces from Ashwood surfacing in the dark, but they came less often now. And when they did, she was there. She held him and listened and reminded him that carrying the dead did not mean he had to die with them. "You are allowed to grieve," she told him once, when the weight of it pressed so hard he could barely speak. "You are allowed to remember. But you are also allowed to live, Theron. You are allowed to be happy." It took time. Healing always did, but slowly, painfully, slowly, the shadows beneath his eyes began to fade. He slept through full nights now, something his beta told her privately had not happened since before the war. He smiled at small things, a bird on the windowsill, a smear of honey cake on Wren's chin, the way Sable wrinkled her nose when she concentrated. The court watched these changes with bewildered fascination, like witnesses to a weather pattern they had not known was possible. Wren adjusted faster than anyone. The palace became his kingdom within weeks. He charmed the kitchen staff into providing an endless supply of honey cakes. He named every gargoyle on the east wall, and assigned each one a personality and a backstory and a set of grievances that he mediated with the seriousness of a high court judge. He presented Fenris the potato wolf to the captain of the guard with great ceremony, and explained that the wolf was to be treated with the respect befitting a dangerous predator. The captain, a battle-hardened man with a face like cracked leather, saluted the wooden figure without blinking. On a warm evening in late summer, Sable stood on the balcony of their chambers and watched Wren chase fireflies across the courtyard below, his laughter rising into the twilight like music. Theron came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "He told me something today," Theron murmured. "What did he say?" "He said the moon cracked last night, just a little. And he could see something moving inside." Sable leaned back against him and smiled. "And what do you think is inside?" Theron pressed his lips to her temple and held her tighter. "Something magnificent." Below them, Wren caught a firefly in his cupped hands and held it up to the darkening sky. His face lit with wonder. And for the first time in 5 years, Sable did not feel invisible. She felt seen. She felt found. She felt home.